You wish all of your writing lessons could come from Gilmore Girls? I am here to make that happen. My name is Gina. I'm an author, editor, publishing professional. I help you make your writing better. Today, we're going to talk about Suki. We're going to talk about Suki and how she was more than just the funny fat friend. The funny fat friend, if you are not aware, is a trope that shows up in a lot of different stories in which we have a best friend to our protagonist who is on the plus size. Now, this can definitely be like open to a little bit of interpretation as to what we identify as plus size or fat in this context. But you see it in kids' movies, movies made for women, shows and movies made for teenagers, for boys, for grown men. Even if the funny fat friend is the protagonist of the story, they will always be portrayed as less smart, less put together, less exemplary than the skinny person in the story. We even see it in cartoons. So how did the Gilmore Girls take Suki and make her not be just the funny fat friend? Because she is not. Melissa McCarthy is just a shining example of a character that really comes into her own over the course of this story. Suki St. James starts off as that funny fat friend. In fact, in the pilot, it's really hard to watch Suki's scenes. They have her being so clownishly over the top as being clumsy and ditzy and giggling. It's hard to watch. And again, that's not any shade to Melissa McCarthy. I think this is a writing choice, and you see this often in pilot episodes that characters are sort of like exaggerations. They are almost caricatures of the characters they are going to become because that's what you have to do. You're trying to get across a lot of context and a lot of information in a very short amount of time. But here's how these writers took this character that could have been a very stereotypical, kind of offensive stock character, and they turned her into a genuine character that everybody cared about. And it's easy. This is something that you can replicate in your own writing. They gave Suki stories that had nothing to do with Lorelai. They even had like a hard time shoehorning Lorelai into some of these stories in order to like make Suki be on the screen during the Gilmore Girls show. They had a hard time, like they had Lorelai campaigning for Jackson, and like it didn't really make a lot of sense. Like Lorelai does not seem like she's super invested in this race, except that she has to be because it's her show. They had a hard time shoehorning Lorelai into the family planning that they had going on here, and I that's a whole separate thing. I got really angry at the way that they handled that storyline. But Suki had a whole bunch of storylines that had absolutely nothing to do with Lorelai. Jackson discovers a bunch of marijuana planted on the back half of their farm, and Suki and Jackson have to get rid of it. Suki dates Jackson, and they kind of, like I said, shove Lorelai into that storyline a little bit, but mostly this is Suki's story. It doesn't have anything to do with Lorelai's happiness, doesn't have anything to do with whether or not Lorelai achieves her goals. Suki is her own character in her own right. And this comes back to advice that I give often, and that is that every single character is the protagonist of their own story. It's just not the story that you happen to be reading right now. Suki is the protagonist of her own story. She has her own goals and her own dreams and her own ambitions. And this is why I actually think that, like, Suki moving on from Stars Hollow in the Year in the Life made sense from a character standpoint, too. Suki hadn't grown up in Stars Hollow, right? Luke grew up in Stars Hollow. The Kims had been in Stars Hollow for a long time. Lorelai had adopted it as her town. Miss Patty had adopted it as her town. But Suki had always been there temporarily, right? She had studied other places. She had gone to college other places. She had been from outside of Stars Hollow. This was where she landed, and she loved Lorelai and she loved the small town. But there really was nothing saying that Suki was going to live out the rest of her life in this town. I actually think it made sense from a story standpoint for Suki to not be working at the Dragonfly Inn anymore, that she would have moved on to something else. And I know that they had to write her out because Melissa McCarthy was a huge star and had a difficult time working the filming for A Year in the Life into her schedule. And I also know that there is some other drama about all of that, and I'm not going to get into all of that. I'm not a Gilmore Girls drama channel. I just know that scheduling was difficult. They weren't sure Melissa McCarthy was going to want to do it, and that was the reason that they largely wrote Suki out of the story. What I do agree is wrong is that Suki would not have been there the night before, like doing stuff at the inn. She would have been there for the wedding. And especially once Lorelai decided to get married the night before the wedding was scheduled, Suki would have been there. They should have arranged the filming around Suki being there, and I will also die on the hill that Emily should have been at that wedding. They picked the weirdest people possible to be at that wedding ceremony. It needed to be Emily, Suki, Luke, Rory. That's who should have been at that secret wedding ceremony. But I digress. If you don't want your characters to come across as stereotypical stock characters and for people to accuse you of sort of lazy writing, remember that even your side characters are all the protagonist of their own story. If you don't write their stories onto the page, you should have some of that in the background, and the way that their lives have moved and the way that they have moved through their lives is going to change and inform the way that they move through this current story that we are reading.